Good morning, everybody. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners. I would like to thank my ANU colleagues for the invitation to speak today. And I'm not sure if my colleague Francis Markham's here, but I'd like to thank him for his assistance with some of the GIS work that's gone into the maps that I'll show you. I started academic life as a development economist in the 1970s, just after passage of the Northern Territory Aboriginal Land Rights Act. I was young and naive and thought that the leverage that land rights and the right of veto gave Aboriginal traditional owners might be mobilised for their transformative benefit, not so much through mining jobs, but from royalties as a source of capital independent from the state. I then went to Arnhem Land as an apprentice anthropologist and found out that the Gningu people with whom I lived were not averse to mining per se. I went off with them to collect white pigment and they joked, "We're off mining." They mined even Delic, the feces of the rainbow serpent Naliot, at a very special sacred place called Gujangal. This was a form of extraction economy. Delic, which some nuggets are shown there, was to be used on bark painting. An example is there, for global sale, as well as to paint on bodies and ceremonies and for fun, or eaten to treat gastric complaints. Delic is a very precious commodity and is traded widely across Arnhem Land. It makes a mockery of state assertion and High Court judgments that Aboriginal people do not enjoy property rights in minerals, did not enjoy property rights in minerals pre-colonially. Mining Delic is very different though from industrial mining, and Gningu, like many other landowners in Arnhem Land, were and are opposed to industrial mining for many reasons. Scale, environmental damage, social impact, questionable economic benefit for them. First and foremost, they want to control what happens on their ancestral land. Here are two pictures of the alumina and bauxite mine at Gove. This is an iconic site because this is the very plant that the Yolngu opposed first politically in 1963 with the bark petitions to the Australian Parliament. A year after, they gained voting rights. Then they opposed this development legally in the Gove Land Rights case from 1968 that they lost. The impact of the mine transformed the landscape, and this is easier to show than the social and cultural transformations associated with such extractive industry. 5 years before the mine was approved, a parliamentary committee warned of the negative impacts from mines like the Nabalco mine on the Yolngu people. 30 years after the mine started, a senior Rirachungu man, Mandaka Marika, explained to me how the open cut mining of his country was like running a grater across his chest. Here are two pictures of the Ranger mine adjacent to World Heritage Kakadu National Park. And in the second one, you can see the Death Adder sacred site, Hybridity Hybridity, or Mount Brockman, in the background. In 1976, the Fox Inquiry reported to the Fraser government that uranium mining would have a devastating impact on Binning people in this region. But in uranium, Australia's decision in 1977, the Australian state decided to press ahead regardless. The Gagaju people could not stop the mine because under land rights law passed in 1976, Ranger was a prior interest or legacy mineral prospect and so could not be vetoed. But Binning opposition to mining is also legendary. For 10 years, the Northern Land Council, on behalf of traditional owners, tried to take the Commonwealth to court because it was conflicted. It owned half the mine when traditional owners were forced to sign the mining agreement in 1978. The case went nowhere. The power of the Commonwealth quashed the Northern Land Council's case. The senior traditional owner for Ranger, Yvonne Margarula, opposed the later Jabiluka mine and defeated the Howard government and Rio Tinto in her global campaign via UNESCO to stop the mine. But the Yolnu and the Binning are pragmatic. As both mines have proceeded, they've accepted royalties and other largesse from multinational corporations. The Ririchingu and Gumaychit Gove use dollars from Alcan to manage the environmental and social impacts of the Gove industrial complex. The Gunjapni Association used dollars from Ranger to ameliorate the social impacts of mining and for other economic purposes. At Gove and Ranger, as a general rule, locals do not work at the mines. I'll show you some figures later. Government officials, politicians and right-wing think tanks are puzzled by this. Surely the battle is now over. It's time to get over it. The Yolnu and Binning are resolute, although other people work at the mines. These newcomers also cause transformative social impacts. At other mines where Aboriginal people own the mine sites, there are similarities. Locals often do not work at the mine site, especially if they have opposed its construction. But other Aboriginal people do. In other places, landowners will seek mine site employment or business opportunity at mines. I'm interested today to say something about the challenges that the mining boom presents for Indigenous landowners in Australia as they face growing pressures from global capital and the state hell-bent on resource extraction. But to what extent is Indigenous land rights and industrial mining compatible? In 1958, anthropologist Bill Stanner asked if the market, what we might term today neoliberal ontology, and the dreamings, Aboriginal spiritual connection to land, what we might call today relational ontology, are incompatible. This remains a good question that can be posed in many ways. Are kin-based and market-based economies incompatible, or the individual development fix and the communal fix? In my view, these are unresolved tensions in 21st century Australia that can be demonstrated with reference to extractive industries. One possible resolution that I offer in conclusion is an intercultural form of economy that I term the hybrid economy, that might provide a means to ameliorate some of these unresolved tensions and offer greater alternate development choice. So let me say something very quickly about land rights and native title. The link between extractive economies and Indigenous Australians today is land rights and native title. Now, in 1788, Australia was occupied by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Australia looked like the slide 1788. From 1788 to the early 1970s, Australia had an approach to land that was similar to colonial land policies of empire, based on appropriating the lands for capitalist resource exploitation and getting native populations out of the way. In settler colonialism and the elimination of the native, Patrick Wolfe notes that the colonial invasion and its transformative capitalist system was predicated on wholesale expropriation of the land and resources. The principal settler colonial logic to eliminate native societies was and remains today to gain unrestricted access to territory. In 1993 and 2013, there were clear transformations in Aboriginal land ownership. And today, about 33% of the continent is owned in one form or another by Indigenous people. The land ownership today is 67% worse from an Indigenous perspective than in 1788, but 33% better than when Indigenous land ownership reached its nadir 40 years ago and Aboriginal people owned nothing. From the mid-1960s, there were two broad tranches of Indigenous land titling. The first came from the commitment to wide-ranging land rights made by Gough Whitlam in 1972, a commitment born of the negative outcome in the Gove land rights case in 1971, when Justice Blackburn endorsed the notion of terra nullius by espousing that Aboriginal people belonged to the land did not belong to the people. The Whitlam law came about for social justice reasons, but was limited to the Northern Territory, and it was limited in scope. Aboriginal people could gain land rights but not resource rights, especially to minerals that remain vested in the Crown. Instead, traditional owners got free, prior, informed consent rights, sometimes referred to as a right of veto, technically a de facto mineral right. Paradoxically, land rights law requires traditional owners to approve development, but then only guarantees them the equivalent of 30% of mining royalties raised from their land. The other 70% goes to other Aboriginal interests in the Northern Territory at the discretion of the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. The second event, as Kieran mentioned, was the Native Title Act in 1993. That was the statutory response to the Mabo High Court judgment of 1992. The Mabo judgment found that there was a customary land ownership in Australia that could prevail at common law if not extinguished. This precipitated the crisis of land tenure, property rights and investment certainty in Australia. The resulting Native Title Act was a law to deal with this crisis. It was in large measure about validating private land ownership and included a process for Indigenous groups to claim land. In the Native Title Act, there is no mineral rights and not even a right of consent, only a right to negotiate in situations of so-called exclusive possession. Native title groups can get 100% of compensation, but their prospects for getting a good deal are heavily circumscribed as they only negotiate over what is left over after the state has taken its share. Land is returned to Aboriginal owners via legally determined processes if traditional religious responsibilities to land or rights to forage can be proven under land rights law, or if continuity in customs and laws observed and continuity in connection can be legally proved under the NTA. The effects of ALRA, land rights law, and the NTA in returning land to Aboriginal ownership can be seen in the following slide. And here you can see the orange, the blue of exclusive possession, and the yellow of non-exclusive or shared native title. These are processes that have been described by Patrick Wolfe as repressive authenticity. It is the state that decides who are the uninvaded Indigenous people who can have rights to land legally recognised. Tanya Murray Lee refers to the cruel irony that to legitimate claims, colonised people need to present an idiom of custom, despite new aspirations, new customs and new practices. Repressive authenticity as a state-sanctioned process has seen the legal recognition of diverse forms of land rights for some, but it has been predicated the denial of colonial history and a false binary. Either Indigenous claimants are frozen in some pre-contact fiction as tribal or traditional, or else they're modern and hence cease to be sufficiently different from other Australians and cease to qualify for any land rights. This binary categorisation is misplaced and unhelpful. Indigenous people today live in a manner that is neither essentialised traditionality nor essentialised modernity. The lack of political recognition by the Australian state of interculturality, that Indigenous people increasingly abide by two sets of values, both Western and customary, and have aspirations that comprise aspects of both, is at the heart of a violently contested, triangulated relationship between the state, extractive industries and Indigenous owners of land, to which I now turn. In the early 20th century, the Australian state has embarked on a new project, the neoliberal moral restructuring of remote living Aboriginal people. This project has gained momentum in the last 6 years since the Northern Territory intervention. It is sometimes couched as a project to restore social norms and promote responsible behaviour. But this is code for replacing Indigenous norms with Western norms. Old forms of assimilation are being superseded by neoliberal forms. This project specifically targets remote and discrete Indigenous communities because they are highly vulnerable, highly dependent and highly visible, even on maps. And on this map you can see the 1,200 such tiny communities on Indigenous land with a total population of less than 100,000. These were the settlements and missions in the colonial era. Today they're townships, homelands and outstations. At the heart of current debates about the best way to solve the Aboriginal development problem in remote Australia, land rights and native title looms large as they stand in the way of neoliberal assimilation because those who own land are remote living, have proven customary continuities in economic and religious lives, have a form of connection to the land that is often oppositional to the desire of the state and or global capital for unimpeded access. At an ideological level, land rights and native title and the alternate ways of being they can facilitate outside or beyond the market of late capitalism challenges the neoliberal project to bring all human action into the domain of the market, a project that the Australian state, given added moral authority by some key Aboriginal leaders, seems to have enthusiastically embraced. Australia is in a mining boom and is rapidly transforming into mineral dependency. Over 50% of commodity exports are made up of mineral and energy resources, and the current boom is worth about $200 billion per annum, 15% of the national economy. Australia is a country with too much luck, as Paul Cleary describes it. And so both global capital and the state are eyeing Indigenous land for future extraction opportunity that historically has delivered little to Indigenous landowners. A map of Australia's 400 operating mines shows a small number on Indigenous lands. What is clear from the map is that large regions of Indigenous-owned land are highly prospective for uranium, base metals and gold. And on this map you can see areas covered by registered claims where the right to negotiate can be exercised. And on this map, which isn't a dot painting, it's a map that represents the highly prospective regions of Australia, and that overlies native title lands quite considerably. It is not surprising that there are renewed calls for Indigenous groups, especially when living near mines, to share in the boom. Not from a fair share of mineral rent or profit or compensation, but via highly disciplined mainstream employment that fits well with the state's moral restructuring project. A recent high-profile example that demonstrates this is provided by multi-billionaire Andrew Forrest from Fortescue Metals Group, who is to head an Abbott government review of Indigenous employment programs. Forrest tells us on social media YouTube, released by the Yinjibarndi Aboriginal Corporation, who are in dispute with him, that he loves and respects Aboriginal people, and that his heart bleeds when locals are overlooked for mining jobs. It makes plenty of commercial sense for locals to take jobs in mines, if they want them, and if they're not ideologically, politically, spiritually, and emotionally opposed to mining, as at Gove and Ranger. The Australian government, irrespective of political persuasion, wants to reduce the employment gap between Indigenous and other Australians by half by 2018. And this will require at least 100,000 new jobs. So mining represents fertile ground for gap closing. But obviously wanting Aboriginal people to work in mines to close statistical gaps only represents an abstract technical solution to a deep structural development problem. People may not want the jobs, or may lack core competencies, adequate health, or the sufficiently clear criminal records to work at mine sites. And the track record on jobs is not great. Data from the 2011 census during the height of the current boom tells us that there are only 5,435 Indigenous mining industry workers, although with spillover employment in relation to other industries, there would have been many more. These numbers have grown rapidly, sixfold in the last 20 years from only 900 in 1991. But today, this is only 4% of all Indigenous employed, and there is great variability as shown in the following slide. And you can see that in different places you have a different level of Indigenous engagement, and what is more, that in most places there are more Indigenous outsiders than locals or traditional owners working at mine sites. The corporates and the state are in agreement about jobs, although they want to fight over the division of resource rents. In their headlong struggle over the division of mining profits, they're both happy to shove landowners aside. Multinational corporations do not offer landowners equity in their mines, and the state avoids legislating for Aboriginal interests to get a fair share of royalties. There are alternatives that I do not have time to discuss today. Suffice to say that much Indigenous land is in relatively sound environmental condition, and landowners are eager to maintain the cultural and environmental values of their newly restituted lands. And so more and more Indigenous land is being voluntarily included in the National Reserve System. There are now 60 Indigenous protected areas declared covering some of the nation's most valuable natural and cultural assets. And you can see that cadastrally in this map, with the blue being Indigenous protected areas, and you can see it diagrammatically in this map, with which I'll leave for you to look at. What is important to note is that Indigenous lands represent not just more and more of the National Reserve System, now over 50%, but it's the fastest growing and most environmentally intact part. I've told them my time's up, so I'll just conclude. I would like to conclude with 3 brief observations. First, there are many forms that development and associated transformations might take on Indigenous land, with extractive economies being just one possibility. I try to highlight this, the range of possibilities in my research that looks to develop a general framework for understanding economic encounter using the notion of economic hybridity. The hybrid economy model recognises, unsurprisingly, that where custom has to be legally proven, it actually exists. Everything in the production realm on Indigenous lands is intermingled with the customary. This is something that the corporates and the state intentionally overlook, instead conjuring up imagined abstract utopias, so-called real economies for remote Indigenous Australia, based increasingly on industrial mining. Second, the apparent gains of land rights and native title laws are being incrementally diluted by the neoliberal state in the name of development. Statute law is amended, the Racial Discrimination Act is suspended, and freehold land is unilaterally alienated as a special measure, as evident in the Northern Territory intervention. Indigenous landowners newly recognised under Australian law have limited options on how to respond, especially as influential Aboriginal spokespeople join powerful state and corporate interests in vigorously espousing the need for the adoption of Western social norms in the name of progress. With a neoliberal political consensus in Canberra, one wonders where landowners might turn if they want to pursue a future that is not dependent on acquiescence to the transformative project of the state in cahoots with global capital. Finally, how might alternatives be constructed for Indigenous landowners that go beyond integration into the mainstream, at least for those who want choice? In concluding his recent book, Envisioning Real Utopias, Eric Olin Wright proposes 3 models of transformation: ruptural or revolutionary, interstitial or anarchist, and symbiotic or social democratic. The last does not seem to have served Indigenous people well in Australia. They have poor political representation, and the first, revolution, has been rarely, if ever, tried. Perhaps it is time to mobilise social movements and build alternatives outside the state. Here, there may be lessons to be learnt about opportunities and risks from Latin America. Thank you.
So it's always hard to be the last one, and I'll probably try to change a bit my presentation to adjust to the previous speakers, because I think it's when we thought about the panel, I really want to thank all the three who accepted the invitation, because they are the people I'm reading to try to structure my own research. So in many ways, they are the inspiration for the current research. But also because I think one of if there is an issue that causes interest from Australia into Latin America at the moment, is mining and resources in general. And a lot of times I get a bit disturbed by the way that's only covered in very economic sense, but not necessarily on how these things communicate in other aspects, like social, political agendas. So because of my background in politics and law, I think, I always look at that side very strongly. So that was the idea to bring a bit of what is actually happening on the ground. And in my case, I'm focusing on Brazil, and apologize that it's not Latin American broadly, but I think, as Mauricio pointed out, it's such a diverse region of the world. And also, because I'm Brazilian, and probably I feel a bit more comfortable to say certain things about my own country than I would about other countries. And if you look at the title, I said access to natural resources and indigenous rights, but I think in the program I mentioned threats to indigenous rights, because not necessarily this has been materialized already. So what I'm talking about is what Anthony Babington pointed out. This transition from a moment where we actually ensured a lot of rights, at least compared to what was the history of indigenous treatment in Brazil, and that was particularly the Constitution of 1988. So for you who are familiar with Brazil, it was at the end of the military regime. We've got a whole process of a new constitution coming, and that was when we ensured certain things in the law. What's happening now is the dismantling, or an attempt to dismantle that system. And it's very clear. I'm going to mention 4 pieces of legislation that have been under discussion. But what I really like from, especially I think, Anthony's work, is this notion of overlapping geographies of power, and at the same time, this notion of a national project. And I tend to argue that you can't understand Brazil if you don't understand how national projects matter and are still very strong. The same issues of nationalism, issues of national identity are extremely important to understand how the country projects itself and gets support domestically for things. And so this national project is very clear, very coherent, I would say, but not necessarily challenge assumptions about development under the Workers' Party administration. So what I'm doing quickly is to outline the broad sort of research I'm beginning, and I should say that I plan to actually do a comparison with Australia, but at this case I'm just looking at Brazil. Just a very brief background on energy and mining relevance to Brazil at the moment, and then this notion of acceleration of development, and the indigenous peoples, again, portrayed as a problem, as a barrier to that process. Then practice and rhetoric, and what I'm basically saying is back to the colonial times. The whole language, the whole rhetoric that's going on is pretty much an old language. Which just, I think before we go there, Christian is here, right? Christian Parker, yeah. When you were talking, it was almost like a frustration with how we keep going back to the past, so we never leave the past. And I think that's my frustration, the fact that we tend to project modernity to the future but ignoring our history. And this is, again, I think, in Brazil at this point. The broad research I'm doing is Brazil's new developmentalism and the democratic deficit involved in the new developmentalism. On 2 aspects. One is the reframing of rights and meaning of what good citizens are, and that's Dagnino's work, Evelina Dagnino's work on this reconfiguration of the meaning of citizenship from something that in the 80s was pretty much, when I was about to go to uni, early 90s, and I shouldn't reveal my age, but anyway, the whole issue of citizenship was so strong and was rights-based. And how we emptied that space as a right, but as entitlements. Entitlements to services, entitlements to market, entitlements to social policies and things like that. The second aspect is the risk-taker state and democratic accountability, which I'm pretty much worried in both Australia and Brazil. I think with the resource dependency in particular. So the political economy here would come into this broad framework. But what I'm calling the risk-taker state is the fact that either by omission in the case of Australia or by hyperactivism in the case of Brazil, the state is more and more sharing the risk in these things in financial terms or in environmental terms, but spreading the risk to society without any proper mechanism to hold the state accountable for that. And that goes into the process that I think Kieran mentioned about the environmental assessments and the dodgy environmental assessment process that happened. So this whole notion that the state becomes a business partner and who actually holds them accountable for potential damage, let's say. Before I go to energy, well, I can say that where I'm looking at energy. This is Itaipu at the border with Paraguay, just one of the largest hydroelectric dams in the world. Brazil has good qualities, and I recognize that. And I should say from the beginning, I am not against hydroelectric dams expansions. I am not against a project for more energy produced. It's not, my point is not that. My point is how these things have been pushed. So there is a lot of legal issues involved. There is a lot of democratic issues involved. And that's my point. So I say that because in Brazil at the moment, the dominant discourse, and the one that you see in magazines, is like, oh, these people that are in opposition, they actually are a bunch of hippies. Honestly, I'm exaggerating, but it's more or less greenies, a lot of times funded by these dodgy international NGOs who are probably against the Brazilian national interest and want to save the frogs and the leaves, but they actually, they don't understand it, they don't have any evidence that this is going to, and I'm not kidding, this is a discourse that's published. Delfim Neto, a very famous economist who was the Minister of Finance during the military regime and during the economic miracle, is one that publishes a lot in that line. So my focus on the political and legal aspects exactly to demystify this notion that everyone who is criticizing is because you don't have any idea of progress or of development. So 45% of Brazil's energy comes from renewable sources. This is a huge, huge amount of participation of renewable sources. The average, I think, in the developed industrialized world is 13%. Brazil has set ambitious targets to increase this participation of renewable resources in the energy matrix. Hydroelectric power accounts for 77% of all the electricity generated, which is also pretty high. And energy expansion is central to the growth acceleration program of the government. This is the Workers' Party main vision, I would say. If you can try to map what's the vision of development, you should look at that document, because that is where it's outlined where Brazil should go, what the resources we should use, and particular investment in logistics, infrastructure, sustainable cities. It's all sort of pointed out in the growth acceleration program. And I don't need to say too much because growth acceleration program tells you what it's about, right? I think the name itself doesn't hide anything. This is from the Brazilian government's website. Large-scale dams to be installed in the Amazon region represent a new national hydroelectric frontier. There is a projection for at least 30 additional dams in the Amazon region and more than 70 around the country, I think, until 2017. So if there is any Brazilian here who can update this information, I appreciate, but that's the one I found in the Ministry of Energy and Mining. What I argue about the Brazil is a tricky case because there is a hybridity in the way things are conducted. So they're not neoliberal in the extreme sense of the word at all. I think the state has repositioned itself very strongly under the Workers' Party. There is the new developmentalism. It's exactly this return of the state to development agenda. And the funny thing is that there is a mixture of investment in sustainability and at the same time a push of economic growth, right? And these things don't necessarily walk together. what I notice is that every time they don't walk together, the one that has priority is the unsustainable path, right? Okay, so I'll go quickly through some of the information. This is the mining trade balance. You can see pretty much the, what is this? Sorry, I don't know, this is not working. But anyway, you can see the trend up. This is another way to see the trend up in the 2000s. One thing that differentiates Brazil a lot in relation to many other Latin American countries is that if you look at mining products, they are important for exports, but it's a very diversified export base for Brazil. So mining matters, but and has been growing in importance, but it's not the only thing. This is Carajás in Pará, where Vale has the largest iron ore open mine in the world. Brazil is also a global player in all these kind of different products, and just given the fact, sorry, that I don't have too much time, I'll make this information available. And what I say, the role of the state in all this has been essentially what I think both of you said, of promoting, facilitating mining research through both investment in energy infrastructure, roads into the Amazon, and all these logistical aspects. Funding and risk sharing, including through the National Bank, the Brazilian National Bank, the BNDES, regulatory security, and expanding the development frontiers into the Amazon. This map is a map that shows you basically the main spots for mining deposits, mineral deposits. The yellow ones refer to gold, and try to memorize this map to look at this one now. This is the Indigenous territories map. Right? So if you look, and particularly maybe this line you can see, but there's a line here that delineates what's considered the legal Amazon. That's the area that comprises the main sort of Amazon as we see it. The yellow dots are the fully regulated, approved indigenous lands, and there are smaller dots that are at different stages. This is distribution of an indigenous population in Brazil. The large dots are high, like the density of the population. But I think what is important to retain here is that Brazil has about 897,000 people who self-identify as indigenous. That's only 0.5% of the population. And that brings the whole issue of the kind of Garcia's quote, why is this minority complaining about the interests of the majority of this country? But it has a very high ethnic diversity, so 305 ethnic groups, 274 languages. Just another way to see this is the indigenous populations in indigenous territories in 2010, and you can see that there is a lot of dots in the Amazon, but also outside. So what happens now is that about 60% of the indigenous population lives in the Amazon area, the legal Amazon, and 40% is outside that area, right? So that gives you more or less the distribution that I mentioned. This is the information on indigenous land demarcation, and you will see that after the Constitution of 1988, you begin, especially with the second government, you begin a process of demarcation, and this slows down quite a bit in the current time. You can claim that it's slowing down because it has already been done, right? So there's just a limit to how much you're going to distribute. I think partially is that, but also partially is the fact that the boom has pushed the pressure to get into the Amazon. And there is more tension, not only the Amazon, but using agricultural land in Brazil. So there is more tension over further distribution and demarcation. How does Brazil compare with Australia in terms of how this thing is regulated? The Constitution says that, I use Indians because Brazil uses Indians, right? Sorry, it's not an offensive way of, but, so Indians have the original right to the land. So the attribution of the federal government here is administrative, is to conduct the demarcation, but the recognition of original right is there. The land itself remains a property of the union, but they have the right to, as in Australia, to access the soil and rivers. Hydro resources exploration and mining is subject to authorization by the National Congress after hearing the affected communities and with respect to their right of participation in outputs. So this is constitutional, right? There is also, Brazil has not only rectified, but has incorporated in its legal system the ILO Convention 169. So it's part of our legal system now, which should mean that they have the right for consultation, right? Well, the solutions that have been found to the problem of overlapping geographies, how do we do that? If they have rights and we want to access these spaces, has been a traditional one. Unfortunately, I say traditional one because I get pretty annoyed of how we dismantle legal frameworks very quickly. And this is just a list of the current bills or proposals that would affect the rules. The first one is a proposal for a constitutional amendment that would transfer the competence for demarcation from the executive to the Congress. And everybody knows that once it goes to the Congress, it will be blocked because of the politicization in the multi-party system, right? There is a substitute to a proposal of 1996 that deals specifically with how to enter for mining into indigenous land. The third bill deals with the definition of national interest. When can we justify getting into their lands? The fourth one is the most recent ones that I'm sure a lot of the government people here have heard about, which is the new mining code that has been just pushed in June under urgency category. That means basically 90 days to evaluate, to assess, to pass. Otherwise it blocks anything in the Congress. And that comes from the presidency, right? So I'm happy to answer a couple of questions later, but I'm trying to actually cover a lot of. So I think my issue here, and the other discussion that has happened a lot through experts, economists, is the environmental licenses as red tape. We need to reform that because it's a red tape. The other issue is that in practice, no free prior informed consent is happening, despite the provisions of the law. When there is conflict, particularly in the two big hydroelectric dams, in the one is Belo Monte, the other one is Tapajós, and they are using the special national police force, the National Public Security Force, to access the area. So they basically call the police and get in. And federal government communication with the economic forces that are mainly the rural caucus in Congress and the mining sector has been pretty good. They are relatively happy with the consultation, but the consultation is never matched in terms of talking to the indigenous peoples. And they've been there. Actually, if you Google now, they are there now. Particular groups are just sitting there because they want the right to be heard. So the slowdown and this kind of insecure situation has also been accompanied by a rise in violence. So there is now a moment of rising violence, violence around land. The rhetoric, though, is the problem for me, and the rhetoric has been, again, a rhetoric of the past, of our colonial legacies. So you see all these different elements coming. Indians as the ones causing the violence, Indians as unproductive, because they don't do anything with this land. Why do they want so much land? Indians as acculturated, so there is research paid by the Confederation of Agriculture to show that actually the Indians are not real Indians anymore because they want TV, they want to go to university, they want a laptop, therefore they are not Indians, and they shouldn't claim that. Or the opposite, right? The kind of authenticity pressure to really remain like the Xingu, the pictures that the foreigners sometimes look and want to find in the Amazon. Indians as incapable is something that's conceptual because up to 1988 in Brazil, they were not considered fully capable for civil acts. So they are under tutelage, like sort of wardship, I think, system. Yeah. And this gives a legacy of they are not fully capable. They are always manipulated by these green NGOs who come to the Amazon with international money again, and use the image of the Indians to oppose the national interests of Brazil. Indigenous territories is strategically forever in Brazil, but since, especially during the military regime, if you look at the map, we know Brazil shares borders with a lot of countries, and the border issue has been tremendous. So for national security reasons, Brazil needs to get access and control the border areas. And I think Indians as an anti-democratic force, this issue of 0.5% against 9 point something percent, right? This is just a couple of things that have come recently. Here you have the manifestation against the constitutional amendment proposal. This is a mobilization called for right now, the current call for mobilization. I put that one because if someone can remember this was the London Games. So I think, again, the issue of Charles Hale's neoliberal multiculturalism, that it is true that we truly appreciate the indigenous contribution to the culture as long as they don't try to gain political power. So the notion of miscegenation and formation of Brazil as, a black, indigenous, white nation, I think it's true. We tend to respect and admire that. But every time that they try to gain political power, then the picture changes. And just to call attention, this is, and I'll finalize here, but this is a report that came, one of these acts of serendipity in history, because it was found as part of the Truth Commission of human rights violations that's going on at the moment. They found the report in May 2013, and it's a report from 1967 that documents all the violations and even attempts of genocide of indigenous tribes in Brazil. This is actually available on the internet, a 7,000-page report. Has received little attention in the media because it's very sensitive. There are a lot of names of people who are still around. No one has been processed or prosecuted in this process, but I think it's just to clash a bit with this notion that everything is going smoothly or historically has been smooth for the indigenous peoples in the last couple of decades. And I'm sorry, I think I really tried to cover too much. I'm not going to go to the questions. But I think that was my main point, was to say that it's not about just saying development, what is the tension between development and democracy? And what is the place of indigenous peoples in the notion of democracy in Brazil? I think that's my major concern. And I think the stimulus of resources has, again, pushed the boundaries. And again, because that's what happened in the military regime, that's what's happening again. So I think that's the frustration of seeing this process repeating over and over. And we seem to be a bit unable still to conciliate the two forces in a less violent way. Okay, thank you.
Well, I'll start with the first one and the third one, and then we go back to the second one. Is that? Sure.
Yeah, I'll do this.
With local government, one of the great complaints across the whole of Australia, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, is that local government has almost no say. And it's a very big problem because local government has to pick up the pieces. Often it's local government that has to deal with the impacts of mining, but it has no say. I don't think constitutional recognition would change that, because the fundamental problem is that the key decisions are made by state government, to some extent by the Commonwealth, and the resources flow to the state, and constitutional recognition wouldn't change that. In the Indigenous context, it might help, because there have been huge problems caused by the Commonwealth government and the Northern Territory government over many years, essentially treating Indigenous community councils in any way they want, amalgamating them, getting rid of them, undermining the autonomy of councils. In that case, constitutional protection might provide some leverage. They can be important in terms of political mobilisation. In some cases, it's community councils working with the traditional owners of mines that have been able to have an impact. In terms of the veto question, John gave the example of the Mirror people who succeeded in stopping the Jabiluka mine, which was half developed. I mean, they had built a big tunnel down into it. They'd extracted uranium. They succeeded in getting Rio, despite the fact that the Commonwealth government was highly supportive. They succeeded in getting Rio to fill that tunnel back in and walk away from the project. And again, a very good example of where political mobilization is so critical. That's rare. More generally, what people do is not to try and stop it. What they try and do is delay it or cause problems. And some groups are very effective at doing that, using a whole range of mechanisms, including legal mechanisms that are unrelated to native title, like planning legislation, cultural heritage legislation. And they essentially either just make things so difficult that the company walks away, and that does happen, especially with projects in the early stages of development, or they slow things up so much that the company has to negotiate seriously about mitigation.
Yeah, look, I agree with that. On the first point, I think that, the government's strategy has been to kill off local Indigenous governance where it exists, but that obviously is only the case in those discrete Indigenous communities. So most, 80% of Indigenous people live in mainstream local government jurisdictions, and the thing that gives you leverage in those jurisdictions is being a ratepayer. And many Indigenous people aren't ratepayers, so they lack leverage in those contexts. But in remote communities, as Kieran said, the focus very much has been on reducing local autonomy and amalgamating local governments in the name of imagined economies of scale. I mean, this is a really interesting thing. So we have these shires in remote Australia that are the size of European countries in the name of economies of scale, but the services aren't actually delivered, but they are imagined to be delivered. In relation to just taking some direct action, I think Jabiluka is a standout example, but of course more recently we have had James Price Point, where a development sometimes talked about as being 35 billion, sometimes 50 billion, has been stopped. Mainly through an alliance, like with Jabiluka, between environmental groups and Indigenous people who oppose the development. Although in both cases, in Jabiluka and James Price Point, there were Indigenous people who were pro the development. Clearly, direct action is an option, and the thing that people are learning to do very effectively is use social media. And I recommend to you the YouTube put out by the Yinjibundi Aboriginal Corporation in their dispute with Fortescue Metals Group to show just how social media is mobilised, and that YouTube they put out just went viral globally. Now, of course, FMG isn't a large global multinational, but you can imagine if that was a Rio or a BHP Billiton, they'd be very concerned about that sort of damage to their global reputation.
Can just three thoughts on local governments. First, I think generally in the domain of extractive industries, the authorities that have been delegated to local governments are very limited, and in certain circumstances, you've seen that some of those authorities withdrawn when local governments have tried to exercise those authorities, for example, around conservation districts, municipal conservation districts. Even in the Bolivian case where there's the whole legislation around autonomies, the autonomies for Indigenous autonomies, and there aren't very many that are in the process of being claimed, don't delegate authorities over the subsoil either. They delegate certain authorities might influence what happened, but they don't delegate authorities over the subsoil. One of the issues around local government and Indigenous movements, or just maybe social movements more generally, is I think the interesting question as to which I think is related to your question about collective action, what happens when movements move into the state, and what that does for the relationships within those movements. And they clearly get much more complicated, and that can happen at a local level, and it happens at a national level. In some sense, that's the Bolivian instance right now. And then you end up with interesting situations where you seem to have Indigenous authorities also begin to adjudicate on what sorts of Indigenous political action are going to be prohibited and permitted as well. So that passage, when you move into the state, I think is an interesting and complicated one. On representativeness of organisations, I think it's true, all forms of organisation and all forms of collective action, and we know this again from all the social movement literature, as well as our own personal experiences, I'm sure, suffer the challenge of representation. And that applies to Indigenous organisations and movements also. I think one of the risks of some of those reflections, however, is at one extreme romanticising Indigenous organisations, and at the other extreme holding them to higher standards of accountability and representativeness than other organisations are held to. And in some sense, that's another play on the authenticity arguments. It's almost as if you're an authentic Indigenous organisation, you have to be perfectly representative in ways that, for example, political parties clearly are not and have struggled to be so. So I think it's a really important point, but one that has to be manejado con pinzas, handled very carefully. On roadblocks, one thing we also didn't talk about is the criminalization of protest, which I think has been an increasing phenomenon in the region.
Yeah, I think about the local government issue, and Tracy is very familiar with Brazil. In this case, it's basically a national issue. It's at the federal government level, and Indigenous affairs have been at the federal level, especially because when the agencies, for instance, to take care in the 67 when FUNAI, the Indigenous Foundation, was created, was put under actually the national security portfolio. So it's a very much federalized issue, let's say. And the Amazon is a federal concern. I mean, it can't be piecemealed. What happens with the municipal level is that it's pretty much weak. It's what happens here. I think it carries the burden of poor services, migration of workers, prostitution, drugs. This is all happening around these areas of dams, but that's what the municipalities have to deal with. But the main division would be between the states and the federal government, right? Ironically, at this stage, I would say that there is synchronicity of interest, so there hasn't been much of a conflict there. Especially like the states that really make a lot of money are also the ones with high representation in the Congress with the conservative parties. So they are the ones actually pushing for legislation as well. So you have this triangulation of force there. In terms of the indigenous rights and the landless movement, I want, again, why did I stay away from that? Because I want to avoid exactly what you said. I'm tired of the expectation that there has to be a unified voice from the landless movement, from the indigenous rights, when actually the state's failing. So let's look at who is doing the wrong job here, because otherwise we tend to criticize. I'm not idealizing the movement. I actually think there are people who are urban poor in São Paulo and indigenous background. So are we asking them to unite with the Amazon to do something about it? I think this expectation is a bit what I try to avoid, but I do think that I actually visited the School of the Landless Movement for a specific course there, and I've learned about the indigenous issues through them. So I actually think they collaborate more than they fight against each other, because they are both the groups that in states like Mato Grosso do Sul, are the ones that have been attacked. So I think the MST is not only a landless movement, but they have a very strong ideological component there, and probably they understand. The conflicts do happen though, and you're right, with the small farmers and peasants who are in the land, who thought they have a legitimate title, and the government doesn't provide the channels for this to be negotiated now, because it's unfair against them. For this group, you're absolutely right, there is conflict. But I would say that the landless movement, there might be divisions there, but overall I think they've got a sense that they are at the same side of the indigenous peoples and land dispossession.
Can we please have a round of applause for our speakers?